Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, November 9th, 2021. This broadcast about in-laws was brought to me by request from some of our coaches. I think especially as the holidays approach, I think the challenge of mixing families, extended families, is affecting all of us. You're making decisions about who you're going to invite, how you're going to celebrate, what is it like when you all get together, and let alone so often over the years, I've had parents tell me what a struggle it has been for them as they've had to make the difficult decision to place a child in treatment, to deal with the judgment, the reactions, the micromanaging and hovering of their in-laws, let alone their own extended family. And I'll talk about why that's a little bit different, why there's a different rub when we're talking about in-laws versus just our general extended family. And one of the stories I remember most profoundly was when a mother was talking about the difficulty of her child in treatment, and she was doing some, along with her husband, some very courageous work, and her in-laws were constantly approaching her and asking how it was going, wanting as many updates as they could. And in their mind, of course, that kind of energy and attention was a sign of their love and support. And without my coaching, the mother shared with me on one particular phone call that she had arrived at a place where she was going to tell people, I'll send out one general group email per week to all of you. I don't want to be asked follow-up questions or any other questions about it. And I'm doing this because I need to reserve my energy for the work that I'm doing with my child. And so we're going to talk about that tonight. We're going to talk about a few different things as it relates to in-laws, because I really thought there were two angles in talking about in-laws. One is, as I've already alluded to, is dealing with the dynamics. How do the dynamics impact you? How do they impact your spouse? I'll use the word spouse and partner interchangeable this evening, but the I suppose the legal definition of in-laws means that it's a spouse. But how to deal with those dynamics, how to support your spouse through the process. But I also want to talk about the boundaries that we can set and giving you permission, empowering you to break some of the rules, to get rid of some of the shoulds and the shouldn'ts. I was thinking about the shoulds and the shouldn'ts just prior to starting this broadcast, and I was thinking if I could just encourage folks to try to eradicate the idea of should and shouldn't, at least eradicate the use of the word should or shouldn't in their vocabulary when they're talking to others, when they're talking to themselves even, and replacing it with language that is much more meaningful, much more real, that has much greater depth to it than should or shouldn't. But I'll talk about that as we go along this evening. So those are that's what I'm going to talk about. The first idea about in-laws, it's the same idea that I've shared many times before. When somebody is telling me about their ex, when an individual is telling me about their narcissistic ex, their alcoholic ex, their borderline ex, their bipolar ex, I will say to them often, that's really interesting. But what's really fascinating, what's really compelling is why you married somebody like that. And I think most people's experience is, well, they weren't like that when I met them. And that may be true because we all put on a good front when we're dating, right? When we're in the courtship mode. We spend a lot of energy trying to hide who we are from our potential partner because we know we know the risk of showing our authentic selves because we've experienced in the past the rejection, the judgment, and the loneliness when we share the truth about ourselves. So we spend so much energy trying to be something that we're not, to fit in and to be accepted. So in some ways that is true. However, there also is evidence in almost every situation that I've explored with a couple or an individual. There's evidence of the signs. What I know about spending time with family, including in-laws, is that as I become more aware, as I wake up in my own therapy, things that 10 years ago, 15 years ago wouldn't even have shown up on my radar now are glaring to me. It's not a judgment to the in-laws or to the extended family. It's just an awareness that I don't participate in those old those old ways of thinking, those old discussions. It's like when a individual tells me after doing a lot of this work that they go back to the dinner parties, right? Back to the PTA, back to their group, back to their extended family or their in-laws. And the conversations that people are having that they themselves participated in all those years ago, or just even more recently, that those conversations don't make much sense anymore. So part of waking up in this process, this is not just a parenting podcast, right? That's kind of how we started it. Much like people send their children to Evoke to help the child, and then like the evolution with each individual in the Evoke program, in the Evoke program itself has evolved to where this podcast is really for everybody and for every relationship. So as you become more aware of boundaries of your own self, of a simple idea like feelings and your right to experience them, you start to see the world through a different kind of lens. You see how common it is for people, for example, not to listen, to dismiss your feelings, or try to get you to feel something other than you're feeling. So when we look at our in-laws and we have this fantasy, I always have this fantasy, at least, that my wife is less mature than I am, less evolved than I am. And also her family is a unique kind of strangeness. Not my family. My family is a very normal kind of strangeness, of course, to me. So we have these fantasies about the others and how different or strange or unhealthy they are. But the question is, what was it about me that fit into that at one point? Not just that fit into it, that fit in with my wife's wounds so profoundly and so perfectly. I experienced it as falling head over heels in love, right? In the early days of courtship with my wife, when we were in those early romantic phases, I didn't need to eat or sleep or talk to anybody else. And the hobbies that I found pleasurable took at least a backseat, if not discarded all the way. So somehow we fit into those wounds. As we think about the holidays coming, you'll have the opportunity, many of you, to re-engage with your in-laws, and I'll talk about tonight about how we can look at that process, how we can step into the process of being with our in-laws and see things in a different way, and it might give you a sense of freedom or peace. This next idea about objectivity, I see this with step parents often, or with co-parents who aren't the primary parent. There is a kind of objectivity, right? When you're the step parent, or you're the partner, or when you're the in-law, or when you yourself are looking at your in-laws, you have in those examples of relationships enough distance to have an increase in objectivity. And because of that, we can look at our spouse's family, and we can look at it with objectivity, and we can point out the flaws, the patterns, the roles, the rules, the ideas in that family that are problematic. But the fact of the matter is that objectivity blinds us to the subjectivity, to what it's like to have grown up in that family. My wife and I were talking about this just last night. We were talking about our own challenges that we're both still struggling with, and she was asking me a series of questions about my own insight, my own self-awareness, understanding to my patterns. And I said to her, it's not that I have a solution for these problems. I struggle with virtually everything I talk to you folks about. But what I have now is the ability to be kinder to myself as I struggle. And that kindness allows me a perspective that I didn't have before, when I met my symptoms, my self-sabotaging behaviors, my self-medicators with derision or shame or judgment. And so it allows me to get deeper, but it also provides me a greater peace and serenity in my life. Every one of you struggle. I struggle. We all struggle. And what I say to my clients, since judgment and shame and fear and anxiety and guilt haven't worked so far, what if we were to try radical acceptance and love. And of course, the fear is that radical acceptance and love and compassion will lead to utter chaos. We're afraid that the only thing holding society together, holding us together individually, is shame and fear. And if we remove that, if we lean into our problems or our issues with compassion and understanding and curiosity instead of judgment and shame and anger and frustration, then we'll become completely hedonistic and out of control. And I will admit, it's sometimes during the transition from that old world, that mother tongue, to this new way of being, there is this kind of coming apart. When we talk about midlife crises, in a way, that's the shift between that some people experience in later adulthood, middle adulthood, this experience where, you know what, I've been living somebody else's life. I'm going to quit I'm going to quit being a Wall Street broker, and I'm going to learn ceramics, right? I'm going to become a yoga instructor. And the cliches can go on and on. And during that time, we get weird haircuts, we buy weird cars, we sometimes struggle in our marriage dramatically. All kinds of things get crazy for us. But that's because the person at the age of 40 or so, which is a typical age for a midlife crisis, although I've had more than one, the person is trying everything on again to see if it fits for them in this new sense of self, this new way of being. Remember, folks, as a parent or as a person, the development of the self is a messy, inefficient process, inherent with mistakes and sidetracks and detours. So our objectivity, the objectivity that you might feel for your in-laws, the objectivity if you're a step parent or the partner of somebody who has a struggling child, the objectivity might not be all that it's cracked up to be. It might not be the gift that you think it is. It might very well blind you to the challenge of the dynamics that we feel and get pulled into. It's like that phrase that we joke about sometimes that says there is a such thing, there is a such thing as a perfect parent. They just haven't had any children yet. So objectivity in this sense can be overrated. What that objectivity can do is it can trick us into confronting the system, the in-law system, the family of origin of our partner or spouse, or even our spouse themselves. And again, while confrontation and judgment and a good kick in the pants or a punch in the nose, we were taught, might be a way to wake somebody up to reality, it comes with horrible side effects like shame and hiding and loneliness and a diminished sense of oneself. And so what we learn at Evoke is that we take care of ourselves principally, and then we begin to regard the people that we care about, the people that we love, our spouses, with a greater compassion, with a greater understanding. And we learn to listen and to see our spouse with a bigger sense of ourselves, a bigger self, a bigger capacity. I read the following quote on social media just this week by coincidence. Looks like it's written by somebody named Vienna Farah. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Her Instagram her Instagram handle is at mindfulmft. And she says this: if you don't understand your partner's childhood and current family dynamics, their core wounds and the origin stories around their pain and patterns, you'll have a hard time navigating your conflict differently and making long-lasting change with each other. There's no great talent or genius in being able to look at somebody else and to see the pathology. That's just easy. That's why the Dalai Lama said that it's more valuable to be able to see one fault in your own than 1,000 faults in others. Or the New Testament says it's better to notice the speck in your eye the beam in your eye instead of noticing the fault in another person. We love to be able to look at other people and their faults and their problems. I joke that the book Codependency, given to people who struggle with codependency, I imagine is one of the most gifted and recommended books on planet Earth. Why? Because codependent people want to fix other people. And when somebody even leaves our intensive program, oftentimes one of their instincts is to try to tell all of their family member and friends to come to our intensives, which, by the way, is not a bad business model for us. But there's kind of a higher takeaway than that, and that is to go home and to say to your spouse, your children, others, to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I showed up. I'm sorry for my reaction. I'm sorry for not understanding what it was like for you to grow up in this family and how the legacy of your childhood is not something you can easily extricate yourself from. This is our life's work, folks. All these wonderful self-help books, all these podcasts, all this stuff is an invitation to a journey of self-discovery, of self-awareness, of self-empowerment, of eventual freedom. There's no quote, no concept, no chapter that I've written or blog that I've written, no podcast that I've broadcast that is the solution or the answer. It's an invitation to a way of thinking, a different way of thinking than almost any of us experienced growing up. I remember one of the many times I've gone to therapy, individual therapy, and talked about and worked out my marriage issues because they're mine. The context is the marriage or parenting, but they're my issues. My therapist said to me one day as I was talking about how difficult marriage is, she said, you kind of have to learn to fall in love with your spouse's dilemma and they with yours. I love that definition of marriage, falling in love with their dilemma. That means you see their codependency, but you don't go out of your way to point it out. You see how they're compromised with their father or their mother, how it's difficult for them to set boundaries. And you don't take pleasure in exposing it. You start to learn that your spouse, like every child, had to escape childhood, had to get out of childhood by using some coping mechanisms that serve them very, very well. That you can't just let go of. One of my pet peeves with the self-help movement is this idea that the simple awareness, the simple identification of our patterns that once served us will immediately mean that we can cast them off. It takes a lifetime. Some of those themes, I imagine, will be present in our lives until we die, even if we live a very long life. And so in the meantime, wouldn't it be nice to have a compassionate perspective about ourselves? And wouldn't it be nice if the people around us that we spend our time with had that same kind of compassion for us? My proudest moments as a husband have been when my wife's wound is on full display in front of me. And I have been able to be quiet and patient. Clean up the spilled milk, literally, the spilled milk on the counter. Instead of throwing down my rag and rushing over to tell her what's wrong with her and her family. At the same time, I'm becoming more and more clear as I live on this earth that when you're talking about my codependency, my anxiety, my blind spots, the only way that I find acceptable for you to talk about them is with love. But to come up and to try to rip off my armor, to try to rip off your spouse's armor, is not an act of love. It's an act of assault. It's what incompetent therapists do and unkind people do. They go around stealing people's crutches and stealing people's armor. One of the challenges as we get married is that we become the adult in the house. And that when we have children that we are the child's parents. And if your parents have a perspective that their job is to guide and mold and shape you and tell you how to do it, they're going to become intrusive in the process. Intrusion is a word I've been thinking about a lot lately. There's so much intrusion. I was able to talk to my wife about this recently and saying, one of the things I've noticed about your family is how involved you are in each other's decisions. I said it in a kind way when we were having a discussion about it. I didn't go out of my way to point it out. That people insert themselves into other people's lives. See, if we are going to support each other in becoming a self, who we are, part of our job is to stand by and support people as they make mistakes. I was telling my wife just last night, I said, it's hard. I want to fix all of my issues. There's a part of me that wants to fix all of them. But I'm trying. I'm doing the best that I can, and this is what it looks like. And some of the most important, you know what, you guys? It relates to you, the audience, the listener, the watcher. I wouldn't have anything to talk about if I hadn't struggled and made mistakes. Virtually every impactful lesson I have to offer you doesn't come from a success. There are a few. But the grand majority of the wisdom that I have to offer comes from my mistakes. And what I've been most grateful for in my life is when I've had people in my life that are capable enough to walk beside me as I struggle, as I wander. So the first thing that we notice with in-laws is they may become opinionated about what we're doing. I've said this before. If you're parenting in an attachment-based way instead of an outcome or a behavioral or a symptom-focused way. If you're parenting in an attachment-based way, sometimes in pop psychology these days they're calling it trauma-informed, which means you understand that symptoms are just the result of underlying wounds and traumas. So if you're parenting in an attachment-based way, most of the people around you are going to think you're crazy. The therapists that you visit will often think you're crazy because they haven't done their work either. And they're not aware of the nature of attachment and therapy and what the experience is. I just wrote today something like this. I said, we do an experiential program. We do psych drama at our intensives. We do a group process. We have a wilderness program for adolescents and young adults that families come and participate in. It's all experiential, right? There's movement, there's activity, there's role playing, there's all kinds of activities that expose and reveal issues and feelings and experiences and trauma and healing and so forth. But I wrote today, I said, if you really understand the true nature of therapy, you realize that all therapy is experiential therapy. Even if you're sitting in a cubicle, in a room with 4 white walls and fluorescent lighting, a little bit unpleasant, of course, and somebody comes in and sits across you in a chair, that's an experience of walking into a room for the client, of walking into the room and taking the risk of telling the truth about yourself. And the risk is that the therapist might respond the way that your parents or early caregivers or authority figures did. They might respond with advice, with anxiety to help or fix. They might respond with disgust or anger or sadness or anxiety, fear. And that is how we were shaped in the first place, along with our biology and the nervous systems that we were given by nature. We come into a family and we learn about ourselves by the way that our parents and other authority figures feel and think about us. Now you can start to see how absolutely difficult it is to extricate yourself from that, to pull yourself out of that. So when you engage your in-laws, you're engaging an entire system that formed this spouse, this partner, and a simple awareness of those dynamics is not the end of the road. It's just the beginning. It's the very, very beginning. So managing their opinions, learning to differentiate, learning to pull away. There's a saying that I've shared many times that a Buddhist teacher taught me that goes something like this: that in order to grow up, we have to kill our parents, metaphorically, of course. And of course, the thought that I had is to grow up, we kind of have to kill everybody, especially our in-laws. And by kill them, I mean let go of what they think, let go of their opinions, distance ourselves from their opinions. Whatever it looks like for you, which could be sitting and having coffee with them and listening and letting it roll off your back, to stating a clear boundary about what you will and won't allow, to the other end of the continuum of saying, I can't be around you. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I don't know your answer. But what I do know is you have a choice. And it's going to be much, much easier for you to pull away from your in-laws than it will be for your spouse. And the temptation that your spouse will have is to stay in that wounded family, right? And to try to pull you into it, and even the children into it. We let our parents treat our children the same way they treated us. I took out the word of that phrase. I took out the word abuse because sometimes when I use abuse, people think I'm talking about big T traumatic trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, yelling, screaming, mommy dearest type abuse. And more often I'm talking about the more nuanced abuse of not listening, of dismissing somebody's feelings, not validating a child, participating in the child in an overly anxious way. That's the kind of abuse that I'm talking about. And in some ways that small T trauma is more insidious than the big T trauma because it's nuanced. I've watched my wife with her family as she's grown along in this process. And she's been aware that things that she didn't see or feel or have a reaction to 10, 15 years ago, now she sees and hears and feels. And it's not a painless journey. It's a very emotional journey for her. And you start to see the way that your family treats you, the way that your family treats your spouse, the way that your spouse's family treats them and your children. And you start to realize the farther you get into this work that it's been happening forever. It didn't start because they're now 60 or 70 or 80. It's always been there. It might be a little more sloppy and a little bit less refined, maybe. But what's more likely is that you have better vision than you used to have. My wife said to me at one point, why couldn't I see my family and this behavior? And I said, because you didn't know anything else. The fish is the last to discover water. It was in the air that you breathed and the soup you were cooked in. It was everywhere. And when it's all around you, you can't see it until you get out of it or have some experience of not family, of not water. And then you start to think, that's different. That's not okay. That's the experience hopefully you have at Evoke and in therapy is, for the folks listening to our intensive program, one of my participants said, I have never felt such unconditional love in my life. And I said, do you mean for people or from people? And she said to me, well, I was thinking about it from people, but I also felt it for people. You get in that kind of environment where people can listen to you, tolerate you, be patient with you, and you start to realize that the ways you've been treated in the past weren't okay. It's essential that we're able to look critically at our family. But remember, when you are the spouse and you're looking at your in-laws, it's easier. It's not the water you swam in. It's not the air that you breathed. So gentleness is indicated. Kindness and patience. Learning to set boundaries for yourself. Here's what I won't do. Here's how I'm not going to participate. I'll visit them then, but I won't visit them now, or I'm not going to have them over, or I'm not going to discuss our family. If financial support is involved, it becomes much more difficult because most people believe, and they have the right to set any terms that they want, that the minute they hand you a check or a large sum of money, that they have a right to ask questions and be intrusive. So that presents its own challenge. You might need them for childcare. You might be clinging on to the moments when they can offer you support. If a parent of mine or an in-law of mine said, "How can I best support you?" I would say, "Do your work." You could say, "Listen to these podcasts." You could say, "Listen to this podcast." I'm not indicting in-laws. I'm going to be an in-law. I am an in-law. I'm an in-law. You're an in-law to somebody. We all have it. The trick is not discovering who's sicker and who's crazier and which water is more poisoned and which water is more clear. The trick is realizing that we're all dented. When a parent said to me, man, I know I made a lot of mistakes. I don't know what they all are, but I want to heal. Then I think the kid's got a chance. When a parent says, we were good parents, I fear for the child. You have to be willing to look at systems, relationships, people, yourself through a critical lens. And the only thing that stops you is somebody's ego. And the lie that we were taught, that if we look back on our experiences with a critical eye, that we're looking for excuses. See, it's all about control or learning how to be. And most of the stuff that we were taught and raised with was in an effort to control us. We were told that there were a lot of shoulds. We were told that when our parents got upset, that we were doing badly, and so forth and so on. One of the things that I've decided in my late 40s, finally, is I'm not going to allow my family to treat my children the way they treated me, to abuse me, to abuse my children the way they abused me. And again, I didn't experience big T trauma from childhood necessarily, although some of you might argue. If I'm not going to do it for myself, I'm going to do it for my children. So my children have a right to set boundaries with their grandparents. And that goes on both sides. That's something my wife and I have both worked out. My wife has the right to opt out of Reedy family activities if it doesn't feel good to her. And I have the right to opt out of her family activities if it doesn't feel good to me. If for whatever reason it's too taxing. We learn to set clear boundaries, but this is a lifelong process. And there are people ask about boundaries a lot. They ask about details. They want to understand boundaries from every possible perspective. But what I really think they're looking for is some answer or explanation that'll make it easy. Boundaries are hard because when we tried to set them as children, we were told that we were bad kids. And bad kids get left and abandoned and they don't do well. The enemy, and I will talk about this as we move along tonight, the enemy to setting good boundaries is not your lack of understanding of boundaries. It's the threat that you feel when you assert them. And so in what my wife and I call marriage 2.0, when we kind of grew up a little bit more about 10 or 12 years ago, one of the rules that we established in our family is that we get to decide individually who we spend time with. As I mean, it almost sounds ridiculous to say out loud because there's so many rules and obligations. You have to support family. You have to go home for the holidays. I can't go by my all of that nonsense and noise about the way that things should be. That is just toxicity. That is the thinking of an alcoholic or an abusive family. But when you're allowed to be yourself, you don't need as many self-medicators, weirdly enough. You don't need maladaptive coping mechanisms when you're allowed to and supported to be yourself. And so taking distance is an important part, and starting to say to in-laws, this is not open for discussion. I'm not willing to discuss this. I'm not willing to hear your opinion. I love this. This quote is from the Letters of Juliet. This is a quote that after the Knight from the Knight in Rusty Armor, this is a sequel that J.D. Gill wrote for the Knight in Rusty Armor. After the Knight went off to work on getting his armor off, and Juliet was left with her son Christopher, we learned that in the Knight in Rusty Armor. J.D. writes a story about her journey, the feminine journey inward. And in the first chapter on the second page, she said this. She said, "My mother came to stay, but your son," this is a letter she's writing to the Knight, "but your son only cried and was very cold to her. I must say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I tried to comfort him, but he would always test the limits and end up hurting everyone's feelings. Perhaps it is a male trait. This little boy, Christopher, has lost his father. He's off. They don't know where he's gone and when he'll be back. And Juliet is left with Christopher, and her mother comes to visit. And because of the induction into the system that Juliet grew up in, the adults were right and the kid was wrong. It wasn't a time to understand and empathize that the kid was struggling and that whatever acting out he might be displaying was a sign of his fear and anxiety and the lack of solid ground that he was standing on. No, it wasn't that at all. It was, he's a bad kid and it's probably your fault, is what she's saying in this passage. Because that's what we do to children. We scapegoat them. We take the sins of the entire village. We symbolically place them on the scapegoat, the child, and we send them out for a sacrifice. That's what the story is about. So understanding the dynamics, understand that you married into it, understanding that your dilemma somehow fits so well with your spouse's dilemma that you fell madly in love with them. That's a part of it. But now that you're in it and you're operating, let's talk a little bit about boundaries. First of all, like I said, it's really important to practice kindness with yourself. Again, I know it's terrifying. Kindness is terrifying. It's terrifying to be kind to somebody who's hurt you. It's terrifying to be kind to yourself when you keep making mistakes and hurting people. Because the only way that you've learned that people can be managed and controlled is through the opposite, a lack of kindness, cruelty, punishment, derision, anger, rage, intimidation, shame, guilt, and so forth. So you get rid of those things, there's no guardrails. It's hedonism and chaos. I was just explaining this to someone today, and I explain it often using the musical Les Miserables, originally based on the book by Victor Hugo. When Jean Valjean, many of you have seen it, when Jean Valjean was released from prison, didn't have a place to go, was taken in by the bishop, ended up assaulting the bishop and stealing all of his silver. He was caught by the police and brought back to the bishop. And the police essentially said to the bishop, "We found this man with this bag of silver. We know that he was here last night. And we want to confirm that he's stolen from you. And if you've seen it, you won't forget what the bishop did and said." The bishop looked at Jean Valjean and he basically said, "You fool. You forgot to take the most expensive part. You forgot to take the candlesticks, the silver candlesticks." And he places them in the bag. And the police, of course, apologized because from this perspective, there's been a misunderstanding, and obviously he was the guest, and all the silver was given to him. And the police leave the scene, and the bishop, through song, says, "Now take this gift of God's love, which means a love that you don't deserve. It's so otherworldly, we call it God. It's so uncommon on planet Earth, we call it heaven. And it's so above our level of consciousness, we imagine that heaven is literally above us in the clouds." So the bishop says to Jean Valjean, "Take this and do something good." And of course, that's the change. Jean Valjean becomes a different person. He adopts and raises a child as his own, ends up giving his life for her love and for her life. Even shows some kindness to many people along the way, and even to the police officer who's chasing him his entire life. And the police officer is so perplexed by this inconceivable juxtaposition of grace and justice that he ends up taking his own life as a symbol for the old way dying. That's what the story is about. The story is about what we're talking about. There was no Jean Valjean or Javert or Cosette. They're all symbols. They're all stories to teach us about our lives. I said this one time that, when our children watch Disney cartoons, sometimes Disney stories get a lot of bad rap, and I won't get into that. But when children start to identify with the heroes in the Disney cartoons, what I've written is that the trick is not to identify with the heroes or the heroines. The trick is to identify with all of them, because you are the villain and the hero. You are the protagonist and the antagonist in the story. You are Jean Valjean and the bishop in this story. So that's a big aside to say, be kind to yourself. I said this the other night, and I couldn't be happier. My daughter, Emma Reedy, who's finishing her PhD in clinical psychology, was co-presenting with me, and she shared with the audience spontaneously. It wasn't even the main point of her talk. It was just in passing. She said to the group, she said, "Breaking free from my dysfunctional family patterns brings with it a lot of guilt." Now, mind you, I'm the headliner. I'm the parenting expert headliner that's been brought to this meeting. And my adult daughter is presenting during part of the workshop. And she's saying, "Breaking free from my dysfunctional family patterns brings with it a lot of guilt." I am part of the dysfunctional family pattern. So she's talking partly about me. And then she goes on to say, "And I need help to carry it, to carry that guilt. So I go to therapy so that my therapist can help me carry the guilt." And I was thinking, such a simple and profound way to explain therapy. I haven't thought of it in such simple terms before. As you all learn to pull yourself out of your dysfunctional family patterns and to be different, Your family of origin, your spouse's family, the in-laws, they're not going to celebrate you most likely. If they do, wonderful. Congratulations. Life is shining on you. But when you get healthier, the family system, the in-laws are going to say, you're breaking the rules. You're going against the good, against the right, against God's plan, against the way that it should be. And you have to deal with that. And so we go to therapy so that a therapist can sit with us and help us carry the guilt, can validate it, can witness it, can see it, and can compassionately and lovingly support us as we take each step towards our larger self. And each step towards it isn't exactly towards it. It's not a straight line. Sometimes we make stupid, crazy decisions as we wander towards becoming who we are. You need help to carry the guilt. Support groups, Al-Anon, Codependence Anonymous, Families Anonymous, Adult Children of Alcoholics. These are all support groups, communities, fellowships where people help you carry the guilt. This podcast, I know it's not interactive in the sense that we're not talking face to face, but part of my talking, part of you listening as a practice is to live in a new sensibility. And it's not Brad Reedy's sensibility or Evoke Therapy Program sensibility. It's rare, and you're not going to hear it a lot of places, but it's not completely unique. There are groups and therapists out there. Some of the therapists at Evoke who serve as coaches who are attachment based, they understand this work, and it's not easy. I'm going to talk about boundaries. This is. I know that this is not an evening about boundaries, but when we talk about in-laws, the dilemma, how difficult it is for our spouse to pull out of it, how easy it is to see the problem because you're on the outside of it, all of that. Developing greater self-awareness about why you were attracted to such a person from such a system can be very, very empowering. But we are going to talk about boundaries as they apply to virtually every relationship. And you'll get some permission this evening to do some things with in-laws that maybe you haven't been given before. We learn to talk in the first person. Let me get right into boundaries. I've shared this before. I'm going to give you 5 keys to boundaries. The examples I give may not be in-laws. It might be children or other people, but it's the same principle. The first key to effective boundary setting is that setting boundaries is not to change other people. And that goes back to a primary thought that we've been conditioned to think, that the problem and the solution is out there. If I can fix my wife's relationship with her in-laws, I can be better. I can feel better. That's the lie that I believe. If I can fix my struggling child, my addicted child, I will feel peace and serenity and better off. That's the lie or the illusion that we were indoctrinated in growing up, because that's how our parents lived, and that's how their parents lived, and so on. And the worst part of it is they called it love. Boundaries are not for changing others, but they come from, healthy boundaries derive from a sense of self. As in, this is what I feel good about. This is what I need. You speak personally and relatively. It's the most powerful and unassailable position that you can take, and it's not up for debate. You're not proposing some objective truth that you have to debate. It's just, this is what I need. This is what I want. I don't like mushrooms. I don't want to go to the movies. I'm not hungry. So forth and so on. Key number 2, don't make it about being right, but rather about being a self. As in, I might be crazy, old-fashioned, or an idiot, but this is my boundary. This is the most powerful position that we can take, and it sets an example for our children in resisting peer pressure. One of the greatest gifts we could offer our children is our own differentiation from our family of origin and our spouses from theirs. I want my children to kill me, metaphorically. I want them to heal. I want them to get out of their head any idea about what I have about what they should be or how they should be or how they should live. They have to do that to grow up. I'm 53 years old, and my mother would like me to belong to her church, vote for her political party. She'd like me to live close to or near here, and the list goes on. It would be simply insane. It would be mentally ill for me to live her life. And most of us spend a lot of time living somebody else's life, somebody else's should. And it was passed on to us at such an early age. It was passed on to our spouse at such an early age that it wasn't even conscious. It just is assumed that that's the way that it is. Key number 3, similar to number 2, don't explain your decisions. This is really important, and I will be emphatic about certain aspects of this one. Similar to key number 2, don't explain your decisions or boundaries to others. In an effort, that's the emphasis. Don't explain it to people in an effort to get them to agree or be okay with the boundary. Don't say, I'm doing this for your own good or because I love you. If you're trying to get them to like it, agree with it, sign on with it, right? Adopt it, that's not a boundary. That's actually what most people do all the time. That's actually an excuse or a distortion of a boundary. A boundary is, this is what I'm okay with and this is what I'm not. I might be crazy. You can think differently. And I'm going to actually follow through on the boundary. I will remove myself from conversations, situations, and even relationships that don't support my important boundaries. Yes, I'm going to negotiate about the small stuff. Right? That's a part of it. But if it's core to me, if it's a core boundary, a core value, I'll distance myself. I'll follow through on the stated boundary. Key number 4 or 5. Listen to the other. Listen to them as much as you are able to, and not a second more. Respond to them with genuine empathy and allow them to be angry, hurt, upset, any of the feelings that they have regarding your decisions. As in, quote, I get it. You're angry and upset. Makes sense. I'm sorry it's so hard, and I'm glad you're telling me how you feel. Or simply just listen and be silent. When I teach skills like these, I'm teaching you about an energy. I'm not being psychobabblish or new agey. I'm just talking about it's a way of responding. I'm giving you a sense of it. You get to choose your words. But essentially you're saying you can be mad. It's valid. You can be hurt, angry with me. It's okay. I'm not going to try to talk you out of it. And whatever words come out of your mouth, if that's the plane of consciousness that you're operating on, will make sense. Remember, the difference about Evoke in many ways than other parenting curriculum is that we'll teach you skills. We have the 8 tools. We have the 3 circles. You can go to our website or the podcast library to listen to any of those. We'll teach you about boundary setting like I am teaching you tonight. But it's really about adopting a new sensibility, about becoming a new self. In religious terms, they call it being born again. It's so profoundly different than in stories. It's symbolized by death, like I just said with Victor Hugo and Les Mis. The death of Javert was a symbol of the death of the old way, the old eye for an eye way. Key number 5, don't use your emotions to try to get children to change. When you do this, you're telling your child that that your feelings are their responsibility. This will lead them to believe that what others think and feel about them is theirs to manage. Don't say, for example, quote, I'm angry, scared, or hurt, unquote, as a substitute for boundary setting. The most common parenting technique on planet Earth as for a parent to display emotion to a child to indicate to the child whether the child is doing wrong or right. And while that might seem like it makes sense, the problem is the child then grows up with a wiring, right? With a brain structure, with a thought process, with a template that what other people think about them is about them. And that's just not true. What other people think about you, as they say in Al Anon, a program designed to help people recovering who are in relationship with other humans that are struggling. As they say in Al Anon, what other people think about you is none of your business. So we learn to be responsible for our emotions. And we do that by going to our meetings. We do that by talking to a therapist, by getting a sponsor. We do that by telling our children, yes, I have a reaction, but it's not yours to manage. My emotions are for me to be informed. They're for me to their call to action. And I've got to sort them out. It's not your job to carry them. People ask all the time, so what's the work? Well, the work, like I said, is boundaries in a practical sense, but the work is really dealing with the barriers that get in the way of setting the boundaries. My favorite book on boundaries by Harriet Lerner, it is by Harriet Lerner, and it's called The Dance of Anger. I like it because, again, she goes into a deeper understanding of boundaries, not just how to set them in a kind of a formulaic way of kind of going through the process, but she teaches us about the psychology. And she tells a story about a mother. This is not an in-law, but a mother with aging aging parents who are asking for more and more and more. And the woman says, when struggling with her father and his needs, she says, no matter how long I'm in therapy, I'm still going to feel guilty if I say no to my father. But if I keep saying yes, I'm going to feel angry. So if I'm going to change, I guess I'll just have to learn to live with some guilt for a while. That's the work. Live with some guilt. Tolerate guilt. Tolerate the thing that you were told was your conscience telling you the difference between right and wrong, which was a lie. Your conscience is not your guilt. Guilt doesn't tell you right from wrong. Guilt tells you what your parents told you should and shouldn't do, which sometimes is very wrong. Guilt is what people feel when they hurt people. And you can think of a lot of healthy boundaries that would hurt somebody. The reason that people stay in abusive relationships is because they're responding to the guilt in the way that they've been taught by their parents. They can't let down this toxic and physically abusive husband. They can't get divorced because they're a bad wife or husband or spouse. They can't get divorced because the religion and the culture that they grew up with them told them that God didn't allow for that, or that there are certain rules that they have to follow to be deemed worthy. That's not what psychology teaches us. Psychology teaches us that you get to set a boundary, and that if you need distance from your in-laws, if you need to walk away, if you need to protect your children from your in-laws or from your parents, you have a right to do it. Maybe even an ethical responsibility to do it. Even if your parents are going to be devastated by it, even if they're going to be hurt. It won't take a lot of self-reflection for people to understand that one of the main barriers to what I'm teaching tonight is guilt. And it's the guilt about what they've been told. A lot of my early marriage was run by guilt. I was supposed to do things with my in-laws, supposed to spend a certain amount of time. I was told that it was some kind of virtue, that it was goodness, and that I had no choice but to either comply and be deemed worthy and good, or to not comply. Even my own brother at some point challenged the way that I was treating my parents and extended family. He was confused. He said, "I don't understand. You're a family therapist, and you're setting some distance with some people in your lives, in the extended family, in-laws, and even our father." And I didn't know how to explain it to him because it's taken me decades to learn what I've learned. So I just said, I know it seems kind of strange, but what you're seeing is the sum total of all the work that I've done. This is the work. Remember, if you're not a jerk in somebody's story, you're not setting good boundaries. If you're not a jerk in somebody else's story, you're not doing battle with guilt and setting boundaries. And if you're not feeling guilt, if you're not grappling with guilt, you're not doing good with your self-care. It's not a perfect idea, but it makes the point. I know that if I'm not dealing with guilt, that I'm not doing good self-care. I know that if I'm not letting people down or disappointing people, I'm not doing good self-care. I'm not growing. And by the way, because the next question I get asked is, are you advocating for selfishness? And my thought is, it looks like it. It's what you were taught was selfish, but what I'm describing is actually a higher form of love. It's really the only way to love. To give out of an abundance, not out of a duty or obligation, or out of ego to be a good son or a good father or a good son-in-law or a good brother-in-law. That's ego. That's not love. The work is transformative. It's not superficial. It's not easy. And you will not arrive. Harriet Lerner also says in The Dance of Anger, she says, anger, because anger is a sign, resentment is a sign that we're not setting good boundaries, we're not taking care of ourselves often. Anger, she explains in the context of boundaries, is a tool for change when it challenges us to become less of an expert on others and more of an expert on the self. So back to the in-law idea with this broadcast, where it started and where it's going to end. If you set boundaries with your in-laws, that can come from a place of anger and resentment. Anger and resentment is when you're expecting other people to take care of you and they're not doing it. And anger can wake you up to the realization that you are the one to rescue you. That nobody's going to come along and rescue you from your mother-in-law, your brother-in-law, your sister-in-law, your father, your mother, your spouse, your toxic business partner, your addicted son or daughter. Nobody's going to rescue you from those dynamics. You have to walk through the fire yourself. You have to unlearn what you've learned. And on the other side of that fear, that thing that we think is going to kill us or destroy us or annihilate us or leave us alone, on the other side of it is love, generosity, peace of mind. Dr. Lerner, Dr. Harriet Lerner in her book explains that we would be wise to prepare for change back messages. Messages from our in-laws or even our spouse that tell us we're breaking the rules, we're breaking societal norms and norms of good, decent people. Whatever it is, we're being selfish. Whatever will work. Whatever we're afraid to be, that's most likely what we'll be called, what we'll be accused of. Selfish, self-centered, narcissistic. Preparing for change back is an important way to anticipate them and to be ready for them. Behavior will often escalate. She explains that a hit and run approach to setting boundaries doesn't work. You're going to be asked to set it again and again. One of the things I get frustrated with is that I set a boundary with somebody, but I keep having to set it. After a period of time, sometimes moments, sometimes days, the intrusion comes back. Independence means, she says, that we clearly define our own selves and emotionally important issues, but it does not mean emotional distance. That is just the result if the person can't meet us where we're at. And the story about the woman setting a new boundary with her mother, Dr. Lerner says, be prepared for attack, withdrawal, threaten, and do the old thing. These tests are inevitable. I wrote in 2018, I wrote a blog called Why You Shouldn't Go Home for Thanksgiving. Now, the title's not exactly accurate. Here's the closing paragraph when I'm talking about all the challenges of going back to a home where we might have outgrown it. We might feel unwelcome. I wrote this as the closing paragraph. You can find this on drbradreedy.com on my blog page. It's a few years old, but every holiday season, I re-release it. I wrote, so we go home if it welcomes us, all of us. Or we go home if we want to see our family with new eyes. We go home and come into contact with a younger version of ourselves. We go home to celebrate or remember. Or we go home because we think it's the right thing to do and guilt prevents us from staying away. In the end, I hope that if you go home, you find that all of you is welcome. And if you need therapeutic permission not to go home and instead spend your holiday with others who love and value you, consider this your doctor's note. In the end, as a therapist, I invite you to explore all of your feelings, and perhaps this may also allow some gratitude to come through on a day in which we are told what we must feel, specifically Thanksgiving. Remember this. This is a really important point. When our spouses are around their in-laws, they regress. When we're around our family of origin, we regress. It's inevitable. Holidays and celebrations, family celebrations, are elevator days where we regress to an earlier version of ourselves. And that is why that younger self who is still wounded, who's responding to compromised people with the same ways of coping, who looks and sounds less mature, that is why that person needs to be met with more love and patience and compassion. So what are the take-homes? To understand how generational transmission of rules, roles, and trauma is so profound, so all-encompassing that simple insight doesn't remove it, and it's a life journey. Be patient with yourself, be patient with your spouse, and learn to set difficult, painful, guilt-inducing boundaries for yourself. Understanding that boundaries are going to be most effective when we are kind to ourselves for the reason that we struggle with them. Being kind to yourself and to your partner. You can be kind to your partner and their dilemma and love their dilemma and still set boundaries for yourself. You can do both. It's not either or. And get help. You have to get help carrying the guilt. Keep listening to the podcast, even if they're a little bit confusing and a little bit abstract. Listen to them more than once. Others will tell you that's how it works. Develop a mental health practice. Therapy, 12-step meetings, listening to podcasts, reading books, talking to and surrounding yourself with people that are farther along the path than you, or at least on the same path as you, who understand the path that you're on. Develop a mental health practice, not when you're in crisis, not only when you're in crisis, but a maintenance program. And learning that a lot of the things that we were taught about love and anxiety weren't true. That an anxious in-law is not expressing love with their anxiety, they're expressing fear. And to the extent that they're expressing fear and anxiety, they're not expressing love because the two are exclusive of each other. Meaning that where there is love, there is no fear. And where there is fear, there is no love. We can feel both at the same time because we're not all of one or all of the other. I wanted to share this. I've shared with you that I have one mental health tool displayed in my house, the list of safe and unsafe responses that I talk about in the Audacity to Be You and other places. This was in my old house before we moved. I had this up on the wall. It's created and written by Brian Andreas. That's a pen name, but you can find his work. It's a beautiful, whimsical drawing. And the quote goes like this: her whole life shifted the day she started to tell the truth about what made her happy. I never knew it could be so simple, she said. That's hard to do. We are told that that's not the answer, that that's not the way. We're given all sorts of reasons. Joseph Campbell, the philosopher, says that our myths tell us that crossing that threshold, that we are convinced will destroy us. And in a way, he says, it does destroy us. It destroys the old version of us. We have to learn to let go of things that we used to believe, old versions of ourselves, old ideas. I don't have any time for live questions, but I'm happy to take them up on our live Q&A, which comes next at the next broadcast. So I'll just close with a few of our announcements. My books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are on Amazon and also Audible. We have support groups online for current and former wilderness families, parents. The next one is November 11th. That's 2 nights from now at 6:30 p.m. If you are an intensives alumni, the next one is December 14th. We also have once a month an alumni only support group for our wilderness families. The next one is November 23rd, 6:30 p.m. Contact Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information. If you want to do a deep dive into your work, to really do this work that I'm describing in a really immersive way, Finding You, the next available one, is December 8th through 12th. It will sell out. We also have one each month, January, February, and March. We also offer this curriculum online, this experience online. The next one will be January 28th through 30th. And then we'll have Returning to You, which is the sequel coming up next year. To find out more, to register, contact intensives at evoketherapy.com. If you want an attachment-based coaching experience, virtual coaching experience from one of our attachment-based therapists or coaches, you can contact coaching at evoketherapy.com. Go to our website to learn more. Our pursuits trips are for families or young adults. Think sober fun. We ask all current parents to go attend 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or AdultChildren.org. Also, RefugeRecovery.org or Nominee.org are great organizations with meetings and resources and classes in your local area free of cost. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just find them using the search term Finding You on Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer and find us by searching Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find Evoke Therapy or me, Dr. Brad Reedy, using the handles at Evoke Therapy or at Dr. Brad Reedy. That's at DRBRADREEDY. Or on Instagram, you can find our intensive program by searching using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us using the search terms Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has new content each week, wonderfully curated by Malia, who's also our moderator this evening. My next broadcast will be next week, November 16th. It'll be a live Q&A. You can submit questions at any time to webinar at evoketherapy.com, or you can also attend just to listen in or submit live questions. You're welcome to invite extended family and friends and in-laws to this broadcast if you want, or you can ask questions for and on behalf of them or about them, and I'm happy to answer any questions or topics related to relationships, psychology, mental health and illness, addiction, and raising children. So go to our website for our upcoming broadcast. Thank you for joining me this evening. I'm sorry for going over. I hope this was helpful for those of you that are challenged with in-laws that feel intrusive and that you're having a difficult time learning how to live your life and operate, parenting your child, working out your relationship with your spouse, and learning to deal with their dilemma, which is a profound one for all of us. Thank you for joining me this evening. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.